Joining us back on the program here, Leigh Richardson, and she's going to talk to us here about our brain coping with mass violence, something that we're all dealing with here as we see the numbers continue each and every day to increase in our country. She is the founder and clinical director of the Brain Performance Center, and continuing with her education. I'm proud of you, Leigh. You're continuing there. You know radio, you know TV. You're also an author. Your book, Turn Your Brain On to Get Your Game On, and talking about these environmental factors that impact our brain health. Leigh, good morning. How are you? And welcome back to the program.
Well, thank you so much for having me back.
Yes, well, great to hear your voice. Rocco's joining me as well, and then Steve Piacentino is sitting in as a guest here this morning, a guest host, and we're going to talk about mass violence, how this will impact not only ourselves, our children, our families, our brains, right? That's what we're talking about here.
Absolutely, and you know, this is a hard subject to talk about because it's all around us. It's in places of worship. It's in where we go to work. It's in the schools. And in 2020, over 100 people died from gun violence every day. So, and it's only growing. It's getting bigger and bigger. So it's something that we have to talk about, because it does impact our brain.
I can't believe. Yeah, I can't believe this is a healthy. Well, it wasn't necessarily a statistic, but there was a news story yesterday that I watched, and this was, I think, it was a New York City story, but talking about safety, and a majority of folks that this individual talked to mentioned avoiding large crowds or spaces as much as possible because of fear of mass shooting or some kind of violence taking place. So that cannot be a healthy attribute towards impacting our brain health, right?
Right, and that's just 1 out of 3 Americans have reported they won't go to a big event because of that fear. And when our brain goes to that fear state, that autonomic nervous system kicks in, and we start riding the roller coaster, fight, flight, freeze. And, you know, first we want to run away from it, then we want to fight it, then we just want to lay down on the ground and hope somebody throws a blanket over us. Mm-hmm. And that puts the brain, when the brain and the body aren't communicating, the brain can't do the best job that it can. And, you know, this is a true fact. You got the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere, and 2/3 of the cells in the right hemisphere are scanning for danger all the time. Mm-hmm. This is the same brain that we had in the caveman days. You know, you walked out of that cave and it was eat or be eaten. Mm-hmm. And our brain, that right hemisphere, those cells are always scanning for danger. Now, and we always find what we're looking for.
Ooh, I'm sorry. I had a question related to that. Now, do you believe that the constant signaling of danger on mass media and different things like that, does that affect the overall cognizance or relative feeling of danger in regards to these news reports that we constantly are hearing about gun violence?
Yes, I do. I mean, when you keep any information coming at you 24/7, that's what kind of starts to resonate in the brain. And during my PhD journey, I've kept that quantitative analysis streaming at my brain repeatedly. And what do I think about when I wake up in the morning? That quantitative analysis. And I think that 10 years ago, we didn't have news 24/7. And maybe 5 years ago we did, but we didn't choose to access it. And I think that what we went through with the pandemic, we felt like that we needed to have the most up-to-date information. We needed the most recent news.
Now, when you look at that, and certainly there's trauma that comes with that individuals would experience and how their brains would react. They actually witness and they're near something or they're part of something violent like that, and that's going to cause some PTSD. But when you watch it on the news, and there's been violence on news throughout, I mean, that's usually what sells on news. And almost to the point where we're getting desensitized to these stories where they used to be so dramatic, where they'd be more random a number of years ago. Now it's almost like at least a few a week or one a day from time to time. And then it's the news cycle, and then maybe if you're not even paying attention that day, you don't even hear about it the next day because it's moved on. It's become kind of routine now, and that's certainly unfortunate. But again, that's different than if you witness it yourself. That's certainly an individual traumatic experience. So if their brains are affected by whether they see it on social media now or they see the news coverage of mass violence and it affects how they view their safety in the world, how hard is it, or why doesn't perspective really go into that thought process where you really take a step back and say, these happen, yes, but the odds of me witnessing or being part of mass violence is very, very rare in reality?
Well, and that's the logical side of the brain. Right. That's the left hemisphere. And I think a lot of times that we don't take a moment to step back. And even though we know if we do, it will probably help us. And just if we can talk about it, if we can create some kind of community around what we're seeing, and maybe that's on a family level. And you certainly have to have a different conversation with a 9-year-old than you do with a 19-year-old. But it's okay to not feel okay after you see something or hear something. And I think if you can start to have that conversation with yourself and say, I know, I feel upset by that. That takes me back, because there's 4 things that puts a brain in a dysregulated state: genetics, physical head trauma. Anytime you hit your head, you change the way the brain's wiring and firing. Emotional trauma and stress. And so you have to give consideration, where is that brain when it hears that news? And what does that brain link what they see on the news to your subconscious? Because everything, research says every second the brain takes in 11 million bits of data. Research also says that on a conscious level, we can hold between 40 and 126 bits of data. Personally, I think it's 40, but we don't have to do the math. Where does it all go? It goes to that subconscious level. So when we see something or we hear something and we've had some trauma that on a subconscious level we link to, bam, we're there.
And especially if, I think, if you have a happy life and things are pretty peaceful and you have a good outlook on life, you're going to view things differently. If you have a life where you're constantly bombarded by stress or anxiety or emotional turmoil in your life, I think what I heard you correctly is that if your brain is overloaded by, even take genetics and brain trauma out of it, just emotion and stress in life, those things could prime people more likely to have their brain be overloaded by just these images, where might make them act a little bit more irrational in their fear and thinking than if they had an otherwise stable life.
Absolutely, because their brain's in a state of hyperarousal.
Right.
And that ties into the body. Those adrenal glands start kicking out all that cortisol, and that makes us more hypervigilant.
And Leigh, kind of just dissecting it a bit more. So, and this is what I wrote down, and I think that you've kind of described it good, or really well, how it affects us, this fear, this anxiety, this worry, how we process it, but again, how we deal with it in a healthy manner. And I started to think about this as you were talking with Rocco. I think that needs to be described a little bit more as far as rational or irrational fears, because there are these irrational fears that we have sometimes, of fear and worry and anxiety, when maybe we shouldn't, and maybe they're not that big. Maybe these are just issues that we, again, need to sit down and process better. But then there's also the reality of the fears that we talked about at the beginning, that these things of mass violence, they are happening in our communities, our place of worships, our mass gatherings. So do we address or deal with those differently than we would an irrational fear? Do we discuss those? Do we process them differently than we would irrational fear, these realities?
Well, fear is fear.
Mm-hmm.
And to me, the best way to deal with fear is to deal with it. Some people can't talk about it. And I'll suggest to those people, journal, write about it, get it out of your head.
Mm-hmm.
Because if it stays in your head, it's going to go round and round and round. And the more it goes around, the more fatigued we get, or the more anxious and overwhelmed we get. it impacts everybody differently, but it brings us down.
Right.
And it makes life a whole lot harder.
And Ms. Richardson, as you mentioned that it impacts people differently, I wonder what your observations are surrounding the impact of, say, like a young child that experiences the traumatic, violent event versus somebody that has a fully developed brain, an adult. I mean, are those two distinctly different outcomes, or how does the brain process it, as a child versus a fully developed brain that may have coping mechanisms?
Absolutely. Thank you. That is a great point, because the brain's not fully developed until you're in your mid to late 20s. The very last part of the brain that develops is your prefrontal cortex. That's where you think through things. That's where you bring it all together. And when a child sees something, the child, let's say a 6-year-old, that's when we start school. So we should have some visual processing capabilities in our brain. Pretty soon we're going to start to read, but we can't connect the dots. We cannot connect, I saw what happened and it means this. Mm-hmm. When the brain doesn't have that coherence, that ability to share information, the brain doesn't know what to do with it. And the way the brain processes information is it turns it into a story. And it doesn't need complete information. The brain will fill in the blank all by itself. And I think a lot of times when you're real young and you get exposed to that, the brain does fill in the blank. Now, and you don't know the difference.
Now, do you notice that there's a certain correlation between children that were exposed to these traumatic events and any long-lasting effects like panic attacks, anxiety, suicidal ideations? Is there any follow-on effects that are linked to a traumatic event like a violent shooting?
Absolutely. But what makes a difference is the support that child gets, how they process what happened to them. If they have a relationship with their parents, or they bring in a counselor or a pastor or a rabbi, but if they have someone to guide them through and help them process what happened and make them feel safe, what the impact in the future is much different.
And how about, I know this is looking at this issue from the opposite direction, and it's actually the people that commit the violence now, and many of them are younger, generally speaking, like in their teens or their early 20s, and they might have mental health issues, they might be on some sort of medication, they might be angry, or they are angry about something, but in terms of how they process that anger. So when you look at kind of now we have generations that have gone through years of gun violence, in mass shootings, in schools and communities, to what extent, and I don't know if anybody's actually ever viewed it that way, but you do hear that some of these are obsessed with prior school shootings and mass shootings, and they have like journals of it, or they have documented that their fascination for prior shootings like that. To what extent do you think witnessing or experiencing or watching, following the news of these mass shootings affects the thinking and the brains of those who might potentially later become shooters themselves?
I don't know, because my logical side of my brain says there's no way somebody could think that's okay to do after seeing it on the news.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But I haven't been bullied. I haven't been sexually abused. I haven't been a product of domestic violence. So my concept and my thinking process is very different from someone that has suffered all of those things. And the one consistent factor that I've seen, and I've done a little bit of research around mass shootings, is that people have been bullied. Mm. And they have all experienced trauma. So they have no physical safety. They have no psychological safety. And when your brain is lacking that safety, perhaps the brain triggers and thinks that's the way I need to protect myself.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy to think that, because rationally, I think any one of us would see that and say that's awful, that's ridiculous, and I don't think there's many of us that would sit there and cheer that on in any way. Yet, for whatever reason, there are these people that do exactly the same thing. So in their mind, they might find some validation in what they witnessed and what they saw, because, like I said, there's reporting of them celebrating these to some degree. So these are all broken individuals that have gone through some sort of trauma that are ticking time bombs to some degree, unless somebody had intervened in their life to set them on the right path.
Well, one thing I know we all want to feel is we want to feel in control. And I think that some of these people have no sense of control in their life when they see something like this, and they think, this is something I could do. And a lot of times it starts off with they want to hurt themselves as much as they want to hurt somebody else.
Yeah.
But they feel like they do have a sense of control. I wonder how that plays into it.
Yeah, very, very fascinating when you think about whatever their motivations might be, and oftentimes we don't get into their heads, because in many cases they wind up dead themselves. Maybe that's their intent all along, but they want to send a message, or they just want to take the whole world out with them.
And I think what's most important for our listeners to know is there are things that you can look for if a family friend or a neighbor or a coworker or a student at school, if they seem to be isolating, if they seem to be unusually angry, if you see them and it's a family member and they stop eating and they stop sleeping, all of these are signals. They're red flags. And I think those are things that we all need to be on the lookout for, because something as simple as a conversation can absolutely change the outcome of a situation.
Right. And I think you mentioning those physical indicators triggers a question in my mind, which is, does this traumatic stress that's put on the brain in these types of extreme events, does it result, and I'm talking, of course, about the victims in this case, does it result in any physical change to the body? In other words, there are studies out there that indicate that, the brain, the way that it's wired and the way that it's functioned can have physical effects on the body. Are you noticing any correlation in that in terms of people that have had that physical trauma, or that mental trauma?
Oh, absolutely. People will develop high blood pressure. They'll be more prone. And people that are in that state aren't controlling their lifestyle choices. That's what you eat, how often you eat it, and all of that lack of mental control over lifestyle choices definitely impacts our physical being.
Right.
Well, Leigh, I know this is a greater conversation, and hopefully this will get more attention when we just talk about mental health in general. I know we've had this more on a local level in our community on addressing some and providing some more services to folks in our community. But if our listening audience wants to find out more about what you do and some of the ideas that you may have, how do they do that?
They can find us on social media, on Facebook or Instagram, Brain Performance Center. They can find me on LinkedIn, Leigh Richardson. And, of course, we've got that good old-fashioned website, thebrainperformancecenter.com.
All right. Tony, our program director, he'll put it up as he continues to produce our show. Leigh, we thank you for the time here this morning, and we will talk to you soon, I'm sure.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Have a great day.